When it comes to comics, there are certain stories that are accepted and widely regarded as classics. These are the stories that any self respecting comic book nerd knows by heart. They're the ones that fans will turn to when they want to introduce people to comic books or to show the medium's artistic merits. I'm talking about Watchmen, All Star Superman, Kingdom Come, you know the ones. The split second we even consider reading comics, these appear in our to read list, the way Tom would automatically appear on our friends list when we joined MySpace. Yeah, that's a reference. And to be honest, there's a reason for that. I'm not here to be contrarian and tell you that everyone's been wrong about them this whole time. I just want to talk about a comic book that I love and I believe is as good as any of those. That book is Superman's Secret Identity, written by Kurt Busiek and illustrated by Stuart Immonen. This is the kind of story that you can't stop reading, but find yourself putting it down just because you don't want to finish it yet. Superman's Secret Identity is a 4-issue limited series that was originally published in 2004. Like the title suggests, it tells a Superman story, but not in the traditional sense. At the center of the story, there is a character named Clark Kent, but he's not the one familiar to millions. So what makes Superman's Secret Identity so great? Well, before we cover that, let's rewind things a little bit to talk about its origins. It was 1985, and DC Comics was in the middle of a game-changing, colossal crossover event known as Crisis on Infinite Earths. One of the main goals of that event was to streamline the DC universe in an effort to make it more welcoming to new readers. Aside from the 12 main issues in the series, the story's events reverberated throughout the rest of the company's titles. Editors were instructed to cooperate with the project, and this led to a slew of the tie-in issues that were part of the crossover. One of those tie-ins was DC Comics Presents number 87. DC Comics Presents was a comic book series that featured team-ups between Superman and other characters from DC Comics, and this particular issue was written by Elliot S. Maggin and penciled by the incomparable Kurt Swan. The story begins with Superman on the moon mourning the death of his cousin Kara, aka Supergirl. Sensing a moment of opportunity, his enemies ambush him and hit Superman with a laser that sends him to a parallel dimension. Superman arrives on Earth Prime, a planet that's much like our own. On Earth Prime, Superman is a famous comic book character. Eventually, he meets a teenager wearing a costume similar to his own. The teenager's name is also Clark Kent, but he doesn't have powers. That is until now. After meeting Superman, his own powers manifest for the first time, and the two team up to stop an alien invasion. After they succeed, they use the alien technology to create a vibrational tuning device that allows them to send Superman back to his planet. Unfortunately, Earth Prime and everyone on it was destroyed as the classic crossover event created a more streamlined version of the DC universe. So basically, it was an entertaining issue that, on its own, wasn't especially memorable. In fact, I think by most accounts it was probably not that different than the 86 issues that came before it. It certainly wasn't meant to lay the foundation for a story that would come out almost 20 years later. But that's the thing about art. Sometimes it can move and inspire people in ways that its creators could never have imagined. And that's what happened when Kurt Busiek read DC Comics Presents number 87. I mean, I think we've all been there. I know I have. Sometimes a seemingly minor character makes an impression on us and we find ourselves wishing we could see more of them. It might have taken longer than Kurt Busiek would have liked, but eventually he did get to write that story. However, as is often the case, the story evolved and became something that, while still rooted in its original idea, took a life on its own and became something completely different. Before I continue, I want to clarify that, although I won't extensively cover the book's plot, there will be some spoilers ahead. The first issue was published in January 2004, and it covers Clark's teenage years. Clark is just your average teenager living in a small town in Kansas called Pickettsville. His parents, David and Laura Kent, decided to name him Clark after the famous fictional character. By now, he's gotten used to the reaction his name inspires. His relatives always give him Superman related gifts, and at school he's gotten used to, and frankly bored with predictable taunts his classmates throw his way. Not too surprisingly, Clark is a bit of a loner. However, one night he discovers that he actually does have superpowers. Although he wonders if he's still dreaming, Clark wastes no time enjoying his newfound abilities. Understandably, he's curious, excited, and a bit scared about his new powers. But pretty soon, he begins using them to help people. Although he tries his best to remain hidden, his rescues don't always go unnoticed. He gets the attention of civilians, journalists, and even government agents. Eventually, he decides to team up with a reporter. She uses her resources to help him learn about his powers and his origins. And of course, she gets to be the reporter who introduces the whole world to a real-life superhero. Unfortunately, she's not as trustworthy as he hoped, and Clark ends their partnership. Sensing her ticket to fame disappearing, she decides to force Clark into the public eye. She rigs dangerous explosions at the local Halloween festival, hoping that Clark would spring into action so she could capture it all on camera. For a brief moment, Clark feels the spotlight that he was craving on him and realizes that it's not what he wanted after all. So he decides that he prefers a private life and he keeps his powers secret. The second issue picks up about a decade later, with Clark, still a bit of a loner, now living in Manhattan. He's a writer for The New Yorker and continues using his powers to save lives. He dresses as Superman, hoping that if someone does see him, no one would believe them if they claim Superman saved them. Even though he's working in a very prestigious publication, it seems his coworkers' sense of humor isn't that different than that of his old high school classmates. He still has to deal with Superman jokes, and one night they set him up with a woman named Lois because, well, of course they do. Although neither of them appreciate the joke, they wind up hitting it off anyway. They bond over their shared experience of being the butt of too many Superman jokes, and eventually they begin dating. Unfortunately, Clark soon realizes that the government never stopped looking for him, and one night he's lured into a trap. After being knocked unconscious by a powerful weapon, Clark wakes up in a government facility. He's been sedated as scientists perform tests on him. Fortunately, the drugs wear off and he's able to break free. However, he notices numerous corpses of people, even babies in the lab. Presumably, they were caught like him and experimented on too. Clark escapes the lab and burns it all down, but he's understandably distressed. He becomes more cautious and even begins wearing glasses, hoping to make himself less easily recognizable. Unfortunately, because of this experience, he withdraws from Lois, and their relationship suffers. However, he decides to reveal his secret to her, and together they decide to face the future and whatever it brings together. At the outset of the third issue, we see that years have passed, and Clark's writing career has taken off. He's continued using his powers to help people, while remaining undetected. Meanwhile, Lois has found success as a residential designer. Their relationship has thrived as well, and they're in the process of building their dream house on the coast of Maine. But as is often the case, life throws him a curveball when Lois tells him that she's pregnant. Clark is understandably concerned about how his powers will impact their unborn daughters. Because of this, he renews his efforts to learn about his past. However, he's also concerned about the government's ongoing efforts to capture him. Because he will soon be a father, he decides to reach out to the government in hopes of reaching some sort of compromise. Eventually, Clark comes to an agreement with the government agents pursuing him. Clark will participate in non-political missions as long as they leave his family alone. Agent Malloy becomes Clark's government handler, and although they don't always see eye to eye, they have a relatively fruitful working relationship. Unfortunately, one particular mission takes Clark away when Lois is about to give birth. Although he resents it, Clark understands that it's something that he will have to accept, and when he returns to the hospital, he sees his newborn twin daughters, and he's reminded that it's all worth it if it'll keep them safe. When issue 4 begins, a couple of decades have passed, and Clark is now 57 years old. Their daughters, Carol and Jane, who have grown up, are home for the holidays and come bearing Superman-related gifts for their father. Although Clark's still working with the government, it's clear that his powers are fading. It also seems that the government doesn't need him as much anymore, which makes Clark wonder if they were able to find or manufacture more compliant, superpowered agents. Over the years, Agent Malloy became a constant presence in his life, and Clark almost thinks of him as a friend. However, he still keeps his distance when he remembers what happened when they caught him. Although Clark and Lois believe that their daughters have developed similar powers, Clark thinks the girls should have the option to decide whether or not they want to share their secret. However, Clark decides to resume his research about his past. After a lot of investigating, he determines that he got his powers from a meteor shower over Kansas. He believes that his subconscious shaped his abilities to match the Superman archetype. Then one day, as Clark is trying to prevent a disastrous train crash, he receives some very unexpected help from none other than his two daughters. The three of them safely stop the train from crashing, and afterward they fly to their house in Maine, where the girls finally reveal themselves to their parents. Around this time, Agent Malloy, who is about to turn 65, tells Clark that he's retiring. He also reveals that he's known Clark's secret for decades. However, he assures Clark that he never reported it to his superiors and destroyed all evidence of the information. Because Malloy is a father too, he understands Clark's need for privacy to protect his family. But since it's finally in the open, Malloy can finally tell Clark that he's enjoyed his writing over the years. And just like that, their working relationship ends as suddenly as it began. And with his daughters carrying on his heroic legacy, Clark realizes that it's time that he retire as well. Time moves forward as it always does. People with superpowers are now living in the open. They work with the government and have helped push technology and science forward. Although Clark still has powers, they aren't quite as strong as they used to be. Feeling content with his life and place in the world, he still enjoys flying, but now he lets his daughters save the world. One of the reasons superhero stories are so popular is that they can be used as metaphors for so many things. Superhero stories might, on the surface, appear to be very far from reality, but they can speak to the human condition. They can provide a window into who we, as people, are. And with Superman's secret identity, Kurt Busiek and Stuart Immonen created a beautiful, moving, and truly special comic book series that managed to show one of the most famous and beloved fictional characters of all time in a completely unique light. And one of the reasons the story works so well is because Clark makes for a truly compelling character. Throughout the story, it's easy to relate to him and care about him. More importantly, he feels like a real person who grows and changes like people do in real life. The story covers such a long period of time, and that's reflected in the way Clark is portrayed. It really feels like we're seeing him in different stages of his life. In the first issue, Clark's voice really captures the feeling of being a teenager. Being a teenager isn't easy for everybody. It can be a lonely time. You can feel like you're different from everyone. It's hard to find your people when you don't even know who you are yet. It can feel like no one would understand what you're going through. And that's why Clark, like so many of us, is quick to dismiss his parents' very reasonable advice. How could parents understand? It's not like they've ever been teenagers themselves, right? But it also shows what can happen when we open up a bit. Sometimes getting to know people just takes one small step. But as the story moves on, the years fly by, so it's important that it feels like Clark has lived those years. A lot of times it can feel like protagonists don't change. In some stories, years pass by, but the character feels the same. When Clark moves to the city, he's still Clark, but you get the sense the years have gone by. He's no longer a kid, but he's still figuring things out. Clark, like many people, gets so caught up pursuing his career that he almost forgets to live his life, not even realizing what he's missing out on. He also sees how love can sneak up on you and knock your socks off. The story shows how exhilarating it can be to find a partner who understands us, but also how scary it can be to take the plunge and let the other person in. And of course, how satisfying it is when we finally do. And we get to see how that affects Clark. He and Lois built a life together, and they have their own secret club. The silly Superman jokes don't matter as much anymore because she's there to roll her eyes with him. And as he grows older, he becomes more comfortable in his own skin. However, life always has a way of surprising us. And when Lois finds out she's pregnant, we really see Clark's world turned upside down. You understand the doubts and fears that he's feeling. you see that he's realizing that his life doesn't really belong to him anymore. And finally, as he reaches retirement, he finds himself looking back. He isn't ready to call it a day. He wants more time, and like a lot of people, at one point tries to fight the passing of time. But he also sees his priorities change. He looks back and realizes that the things that mattered aren't as important as he once thought, and watching his happy, grown-up daughters leaves him content and fulfilled. On their own, each issue provides a snapshot of different stages of Clark's life, and each one feels like a complete story. But they come together to paint a larger picture, a portrait of a life lived. Another great thing the story does is that it recontextualizes the very idea of a secret identity. Usually only think of that as something comic book characters have. But the reality is, we all have our own version of a secret identity, a side of ourselves that we see as a real us and only share it to those closest to us. But since comic books are a visual medium, the art is obviously very important. And while pretty art can't be a substitute for a good story, bad art can make a good story less enjoyable to read. Luckily, Stuart Immonen's work is beautiful and incredibly captivating. His command on figure drawing is impeccable. A lot of times in superhero comics, it can feel like every character is an Adonis or a supermodel. Every male character, from a homeless person to a surgeon, looks like they could be an action movie star. And of course, most female characters look and dress like they could be Victoria's Secret models. But here, they feel like real people. Each character has their own distinct physique, and you get the sense that every single person has their own personal story. That extends to their natural, unique facial expressions that really makes them come alive. Even the clothes feel like they received plenty of attention. I could spend hours just staring at all the individual folds and wrinkles on a character's sleeves. And even though it's not a traditional superhero comic, he still manages to give us the iconic moments. The splash pages feel like widescreen cinematic shots. They give beautiful panoramic views of the breathtaking, wide-open locales. They also show the excitement Clark feels when he can finally let go without worrying about his secret being discovered. However, the comic never feels like a loosely stitched collection of pinups. The visual storytelling is always very clear, and the coloring is as unique as the story. Unlike most superhero comics, Stuart Immonen did it all himself. His palette is inspired by 1950s advertisement art, and it is bold and beautiful. It really is breathtaking, but more importantly, it captures the mood of the story perfectly. It doesn't feel like he used a uniform style for the whole series, but instead approached each scene, page, or even panel depending on what it called for. I even love his unique shading approach. I'm not 100% sure, but it looks like he left his pencils instead of erasing them. They can be seen through the colors and they give a really cool shading effect. And the art works perfectly with the story to create something truly unforgettable. I think if you read enough superhero comics, it could feel like you've read them all. Every crossover event or even issue can start to feel like a variation on something that came before. Luckily, all we have to do is step back and look away from the continuity-reliant issues. When we do that, we're liable to find hidden gems like Superman's secret identity. This completely unique series manages to use one of the most iconic fictional characters of all time in a completely unique way that also feels so natural that you can't help but wonder why it wasn't done before. It's a story that deserves to be listed among the best the medium has to offer, and it can remind you why you fell in love with superhero comics in the first place.